Alright, so we're going to be doing a ban list discussion from the ban list on Monday. I know it's a little bit late. A lot of people have already kind of moved on to Avatar stuff because of the early access, and we will be covering our Avatar set review, but for now I have a lot of thoughts on the BNR list, and maybe paper play can come back in some capacity, and that's what I'm hoping at least. So I'm just going to briefly go through, what they banned initially, and then Nick and I will kind of have our thoughts on their philosophy and our ideas on Standard and Pioneer and what we like or dislike about these bans. So to start with is Standard, where I'm sure, as everyone is aware, Vivi, Screaming Nemesis, and Profts were all banned. For me personally, I think this was like a good, reasonable ban, and I'm more than happy to play in a format without these cards, and I kind of was hoping that they would ban Profts and Nemesis as well, so I think that's pretty good. And then the other notable one, for me at least, is in Pioneer, they banned Heartfire Hero, which I suppose comes as a shock to many people, because Pioneer was memed as a dead format. WotC's trying to kill it, especially in a world of 3-year Standard. So it's a little bit welcome to have that kind of change as well. And then Popper
If nothing else,
so yeah.
If nothing else, the change for Pioneer of the fact that WotC is still looking at the format, actively making considerations for that, gives me a lot of hope for the future of the format.
Oh yeah.
On top of the fact that they've made acknowledges that they're looking towards changing future RCQ formats to include Pioneer, but we'll talk more about that later.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this has to do with Arena. With the play rates on Magic Online so low this year, basically for every format. So at the moment, for example, post-ban in both of these formats, neither one has yet to break 200 players in the leagues on Magic Online for Standard and Pioneer, just for reference. And it's Pioneer's been at kind of the 100 to 150 players in active in leagues for the whole last year, basically. So I have to imagine Arena kind of gave them a lot more confidence in analyzing the format. So let's kind of go down to their philosophy, where they mentioned Standard. So here we go. Standard in a poor shape. Yeah, I think everyone kind of knows that. Is it Cauldron? Yep. Best deck in format, most popular deck in format, no bad matchups. Just another day in 2025 Standard. Specifically calling out the combo of Vivi and Soul Cauldron is good, because as anyone who's played Standard has played against that, and the combo itself is kind of ridiculous. I do agree with them banning Vivi instead of Cauldron, because Cauldron, while it does have a deck building cost, I think Vivi's deck building cost is less, as in just putting on creatures in your deck, right? And we've seen both of cards in both Vayne be good before. Cauldron was basically fine all the way up until Vivi, right? Saw some play in Insidious Roots, and it was really, really good in Roots pre-rotation, right? Very good. But that deck was not, super broken in the context of things. And it feels that you wouldn't need to ban both parts of the combo, to me. So I think just banning one makes a lot of sense. And so I think them banning Vivi was good. That's basically.
I would also,
I
would also add that there's more interesting things that you get to do with a card like Cauldron than Vivi. People have already talked about and started deck building with cards like Loot. That was the first thing we all thought about when Loot came out. It's you can put it in the soup, and then you can do a bunch of Cauldron things. I'll put a second Loot in there, and you start doing more. And I think that sort of thing is good, and that's an enjoyable thing to have. We've had Cauldron decks in the past, especially pure rotation, where we had Combi of Forgotten Lore, and you would do a bunch of ramp things, and you had a combo kill with Realm Scorched Hellkite. But it's one of those things where you have to put a bunch of bad cards in your deck typically. The problem with the current version of the Cauldron deck, or that's the most recent version of the Cauldron deck, was that it had no bad cards. You just played this combo on top of your good blue and red mid-range cards.
And you just discard it to one of your 70 discard outlets, right? If you draw it at a bad time. I had multiple games at RCQ where I just cast it. I was I drew my second and third Cauldron. I'll just discard them. It's fine, It doesn't matter, right? Or they kill it, right? And because, you can't overcommit, right? So things that would destroy all artifacts don't actually mitigate multiple cauldrons the way they would hit multiple ghost vacuums. It's just like
it's also so wild how Vivi was like basically the first time in modern standard that we've had like a deck that actually Xeroxed in the way that old Xerox did, and it just made the deck ultra consistent and ultra powerful in a way that was obviously busted, especially when the deck also makes free mana. It's just conceptually an interesting deck to think about, but
absolutely. I think if it was not nearly as powerful, I think it would be good and healthy for the format to have that. Reminds me quite a bit of when Arclight Phoenix was in Standard. That deck was really good, and that deck was really good for its entire time in Standard, basically. But that deck was like very unique and interesting for the format.
And also like it took a long time for people to develop it. It ended up being the best deck in the format at the end of Guilds, but it was not there the whole time. Whereas like in today's day and age, these sort of things are figured out much more quickly.
So we have Arclight took a while at Guilds. There was a couple of like the Japanese players who played it at the Pro Tour, and it mostly came onto the scene to counter like the Golgari decks, right? And the Jeskai control decks, which were trying to counter the white aggro decks. And then turns out Arclight was like pretty solid against all of them. So so very reminiscent of that, but obviously like tuned up to like 11. I will say I am kind of interested in some Agatha Soul Cauldron stuff in Standard currently. There's that new card from Avatar that like clones itself, and like putting that into the Cauldron is like really cool. A lot of interesting creatures you can clone from there. And then you can also play it with like Aftermath Analysts and Draconautics, and that was something we did pretty early on with Ether Drift, was just trying to use Soul Cauldron to provide a little bit of redundancy for that combo. But that combo turned out to be good, but not like busted, and it took up a lot of deck slots. So I have to imagine we don't really see much Soul Cauldron, which is kind of where I think that card should be.
So it's like all the rest of Standard, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think hitting Vivi was like definitely the correct decision. I am a firm believer that for a couple of reasons, I guess, that Vivi is likely broken on its own without Soul Cauldron, and Soul Cauldron could be broken without Vivi, but is not inherently so. Soul Cauldron is certainly a card that is main deckable, I would argue, in a lot of decks. Most decks in Standard play a reasonable amount of removal and creatures, that it's not terrible in any game, basically. But it's not like good enough that you'd actively want to play it. People have played it in some of the Bartolome decks. People have played it in some of the mono red decks, even in like non-Vivi formats. But generally speaking, it's just a little too low impact. But Vivi and like prowess shells, right? It is already something that people were doing in the Vivi Cauldron format. Those decks were not nearly as good against Vivi and some of the decks attacking Vivi, but they were still very good and significantly less solved than the Cauldron deck. I also think the deck building with those versions of the Vivi Prowess had more flex slots in the main. So it would take longer for people to end up developing the optimal configurations of Vivi decks in a world without Cauldron. Whereas the Vivi Cauldron shell took up like 30 deck slots, right? So I think banning Vivi was like definitely the correct call.
Yeah, it also kind of leads into the other side of the coin on like in the theory where they banned Cauldron instead, the other deck in the format before we started all piling on Cauldron, at the beginning of the format, people were split on playing Prowess and Cauldron. Mm-hmm. We never fully developed the Prowess deck because the opportunity cost was so high because we had the other version that was better. Cauldron was better in the mirror, so but it's like the other deck was still good. Like you could have showed up with Vivi Prowess and still won tournaments. But it's just like if you already are playing Vivi, why not just put the Cauldrons in your deck and win more? So we have this theoretical future where we play with Vivi Prowess instead, and it's way more likely that Vivi Prowess was actually still quite busted and probably the best deck than any sort of Cauldron shell we would ever play with.
Yeah. I think the big thing that I think contributed to why the Cauldron deck was solved so fast, one, it survived rotation, right? It lost. The only thing it lost with rotation was some dual lands, but the mana was still totally acceptable and fine for the deck without those dual lands. But it didn't really lose anything else with Darn Thrillseeker or whatever. But the whole core of the shell, like, there's no real flex slots in the deck, so it's very easy to just commit to the deck, to testing the deck, because you already know it's going to be good. And that's, I think, generally a bit of a problem. I think it's more interesting when cards can cycle through formats. I think it's generally pretty bad if a whole deck survives rotation entirely intact, while also being a good deck in both standard formats. Generally I would like to see a deck get worse. Like, I think a good example of this is take a deck like Lizards, for example, which is a deck that, from rotation to rotation, when it survives rotation, it's fine for it to survive rotation, but it shouldn't, like, be good, pre and post rotation. And that kind of makes sense, because Lizards was totally fine when Bloomburrow first hit, and now that we've had a rotation, there's just, it's still just like an okay deck. Like, it hasn't gotten better after a rotation. Those are the kinds of decks that I think should generally survive rotation totally intact. But they shouldn't ever be, like, doing something that's, like, so powerful that you should just be playing them anyway, because then it just invalidates basically all the rest of the sets that come after. And that's what we would have headed into if they did not take action on Vivi.
Speaking of ultra-powerful cards and non-rotating them, red decks, Screaming Nemesis being the other ban shocked quite a few people, but I think a lot of the folks at the high level all kind of agreed that Screaming Nemesis has just been a problem for a while, and it restricts gameplay and deck building in a way that isn't interesting. Regardless of even how power level breaks down, Screaming Nemesis stopped things like big green creatures from blocking and being able to survive at low life totals against red and then slowly climb back up. That has been a typical play pattern against red that has basically always been good to some extent, the variability on which has been broad, but the fact that Screaming Nemesis just cuts that off, and the fact that you get to proactively do it on your own terms, especially when your opponent taps out, just creates fundamental issues with gameplay patterns that create a downward pressure, I think, that is just not interesting. It just leads to less gameplay diversity and less deck building diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been a Screaming Nemesis ranter for a while. The exception is, of course, that Screaming Nemesis, in my opinion, mostly got attention when it was first previewed in the summer of 2024, initially as, hey, this is our anti-Amalia card. And I was not a believer that the card would do anything at all to prevent Amalia from existing in Pioneer. But that was where it was getting a lot of, like, discussions at the time, and I don't think people really fully realized the ramifications for Standard. And I mean, you couldn't really, we didn't know what the full rotation would look like at that time, let alone what Duskmourn would do to Standard, and shift that. But yeah, absolutely, Nemesis is just a card that is just so powerful on rate, like 3/3/3 Haste Boros Reckoner is just very good on its own. It didn't really need any sort of anti-life gain rider, and they've added so much incremental life gain. I get that, people like to bring up that, life gain sucks in constructed Magic, and that's generally true. Life gain dedicated decks generally are pretty bad. They have some metagame success in certain formats. We saw Amalia decks in Standard actually be, like, reasonable in the Corey Steelcutter metagame. And we've seen decks like Soul Sisters and stuff in prior Modern formats pop up. And like Martyr Proc and stuff too, which are, like, fairly dedicated life gain decks. There wasn't a lot of life gain payoffs in Magic very much. Compared to now, there's a lot more now, but they would have played them if they existed. But they were generally, like, to counter certain decks. And so we haven't really seen, like, those decks in a while, but what we have seen is an abundance of incremental life gain. Golgari midrange and Standard, for example, has Restless Cottage, which generates, food tokens and things like Virtue of Persistence, which should exist as a counter to some of these aggro decks, is effectively unplayable. Something like Lightning Helix, which you would play even in a world of 4 Sunspine Links and 4 Screaming Nemesis in these 3 and 4 color Jeskai based control decks, just because it's better than Lightning Strike. If they don't draw the anti-life gain card, it's significantly better, so you play it, right? And then against like other decks, it mitigates your painful mana base, so you kind of just played it anyway. So there was a lot of incremental life gain in this standard format, and it's all been slowly shoved out. Look at the decline in cards like Preacher of the Schism, Sheltered by Ghosts, and Beza, because of how good mono red is. Now, some of that is Vivi doesn't care about those cards either, so it is more than one context, but in general, cards like Sheltered by Ghosts should be very good against red, and I do think that, it's good to push red to be powerful, but the trade-off, of course, needs to be that sideboard cards can meaningfully counter the deck. Not that red shouldn't have the ability to counter sideboard cards in some situations, but shouldn't be able to main deck it on rate. I every time that I build a deck list in pre-ban standard, it was effectively my sideboard plan against red is just to hope they only draw 1 Screaming Nemesis, and that I'm trying to race it. There was no other, I'm going to kill all your threats, and we're going to scrape by, and I'll slowly creep back into the game and put you down to just a small amount of resources. Red doesn't have to play cards that would normally fit the Urbrask's Forge role, like Case of the Crimson Pulse and Chandra and stuff, because you can't gain life against them. So they just only need to play enough burn spells to deal 20 damage over the course of 10 turns, right? But you should be able to fight mono red by going pretty low, using all your resources to 1-for-1 the mono red player, maybe get a 2-for-1, and then try and stabilize from there. And Screaming Nemesis and Sunspine Links together kind of just made it too difficult to ever really accomplish that. And so I think banning Screaming Nemesis was a fantastic ban. I wish that more people really understood the impact that card had. And there's a degree of Screaming Nemesis red was so powerful that it made it so that way the cards that it counters just don't exist in the format, right? So it's very easy to point to, see, people already aren't playing the anti-red sideboard cards, right? And a lot of that's because they don't actually work against the deck, so why would you play them to begin with? It's funny that Devout Decree was arguably better against Fear of Missing Out than it was against the red creatures in the format.
Wild.
So
yeah. The other thing with Screaming Nemesis especially is that one of the important things against the Edrex is sometimes getting tricksy and blowing them out in combat, or just having something big in the way. Screaming Nemesis and before it, Monstrous Rage, did both of those, invalidated both of those game plans in a way that just feels egregious. I remember specifically trying Archfiend to the draw stacks, and my opponent playing Screaming Nemesis, I have no outs here. This Screaming Nemesis will just kill me. Yep. Even though, I can just beat it in with my 6/6, I can never block that thing anymore.
Yep.
And it's just in days of prior years, Screaming Nemesis would have... Archfiend to the Dross would have been an excellent card against the red decks because it's so hard for them to answer. But now you just attack with impunity. I'm not saying that gameplay is fundamentally wrong, but on a card that is already very good for the red decks, feels a bit egregious. Not to mention the interactions with cards like Fire Magic. Oh my goodness, Fire Magic with your own Screaming Nemesis on board was always just unreal. But I digress. It also feels one last bit weird that we also got Sunspine Links and Screaming Nemesis in back-to-back sets.
Yeah, I know they mentioned in part of their discussion here that they were mostly under the assumption that Screaming Nemesis would be a counter to help red when it was heavy under attack. And that ended up not really being the case. I know for basically the entire time that Screaming Nemesis has been legal in Standard, Mono Red, up until the Vivi formats, Mono Red had around a 54% win rate. in many cases, it was like the most played deck and the highest win rate, similar to Vivi, not quite as egregious as Vivi and Cutter decks were, but it basically always persisted at a very high win rate, uh, with the Screaming Nemesis plans in the main. But yeah, it definitely looks like they were under the impression that Screaming Nemesis would help red decks in a weak format for red decks, and they ended up totally misevaluating, like missing the mark on that, and red ended up being basically the strongest color in standard for the entire last year. And it isn't that thanks to like any one specific card, right? Like there's just been multiple different types of red decks that are all pretty good.
Yeah, like Screaming Nemesis is the 5th red card to get banned.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Obviously, like Cutter and Vivi are slightly different, but we just banned Heartfire Hero Monstrous Rage.
Right.
And the red deck is still one of the best decks to play, and like wins tournaments all the time.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, definitely they definitely missed the mark on that one, and maybe if they had more time to test these things or less sets to juggle with the testing, they might have caught how impactful Screaming Nemesis was, and maybe would have just removed the life gain rider entirely. Honestly, card is probably acceptable in standard if it doesn't shut off life gain, because like playing a card like Lightning Helix against it actually is fine. You don't feel that bad as a red player if you've still countered their Lightning Helix. Like when you play a 1-drop and they Lightning Helix, it feels really bad. But if the Lightning Helix is just a Doomblade, it's a lot less bad. So yeah, and then the next one obviously was Proft's Eidetic Memory, which was banned. And I remember when this came out, I didn't really have like strong opinions of it at the time. But I was very excited to play with it in Arclight Phoenix and Pioneer, and I had a bunch of 5-0s with Profts in Phoenix, and it's not quite a staple in stock Phoenix anymore because Corey Steelcutter takes up so many slots, but they do still play it in a lot of versions, and it's been really, really powerful in that type of deck. And then obviously in Standard, when Fear of Missing Out, and then all that stuff, and the Oculus decks were like more refined and figured out, obviously the big one was like Mako, like tied the whole engine together. Now instead of just raw card draw effects, you end up playing a bunch of looting effects. So Proft's Eidetic Memory, in my opinion, was the most powerful card in the Vivi deck. It was a big reason why you couldn't use Graveyard Hate combined with removal to end up fighting through them, because now you have to kill every single creature. Every single creature they play, when they have a Profts in play, is just bigger than everything else. They're all 4/4s and 5/5s and sometimes bigger. The interaction with Fear of Missing Out is just absolutely disgusting, and something they missed when they were testing with Fear of Missing Out. They just didn't even see that combination. And then obviously the big like extra power level was Winter Night Stories. It's disgusting with Profts because it also then lets you harmonize in the same turn, basically for the full 1 mana. So you can go from having a board state of just Proft's Eidetic Memory and then go play creature, play Winter Night, harmonize Winter Night, pass, and you're just up an obscene amount of cards and have a giant creature for the next turn. But Quantum Riddler, obviously very good with Profts, but I think the big thing that Quantum Riddler did is it meant that you couldn't just kill all their creatures, which was one of the ideas against Jeskai Oculus. Was, yeah, they have Profts, and their creatures are really good with Profts, but they didn't really have a good way to go up on cards very much, because they didn't play a high density of instants and sorceries or creatures with flying for Steamcore Scholar, and so cards like Tursa never put you up on cards, and Steamcore would only sometimes, and so it was a lot easier to just kill all their key creatures and get through there. But with Quantum Riddler combined with Profts, you just can never run out of cards, and you just always have a big flying creature to play, and it's a lot easier to go up on cards. And so yeah, the whole package and the engine was powerful, but Profts itself was what contributed to all of the, not all of the power, but the bulk of the inability, I think, to adapt to the Vivi deck. In my opinion, was Proft's Eidetic Memory, and it's a card that I've been calling a ban for a while.
Yeah.
So
one of those things that, looking at it and looking at how the deck sometimes plays, it can be almost assuming, but the important thing is just your backup plan was better than a lot of decks' primary plans.
Yes.
And the fact that you just played Mako, played that, you had a 2/2, and then it turned to a Wild Nacatl, and then it just got out of control very quickly, and it also contributed to this play pattern kind of Yahtzee of, well, I have a great hand against the Cauldron draws, but if they play Profts on 2, I don't have a good answer because they're just going to play 3 creatures out, and they're all must answers.
Yeah.
So, yeah, gameplay patterns created by Proft were miserable to play against, but also just like on power level with what the things that deck was doing, it was just egregious. Like, it wasn't uncommon for Proft to put in 8 or 10 counters on a creature in a single turn on like 5.
Yeah. Yeah, again, like, I think decks should be able to pivot and have these transformational plans, but they shouldn't be able to have it built into their main deck on a rate that's so high. Sure, Proft's, similar to Up the Beanstalk, does cantrip when it comes in, and that is actually really relevant, because you kind of get to bait out a lot of removal by just playing a Proft's in the mid-game with no other card draw effects, and you're like, well, put a counter on my creature, right? And so you can blow some disenchants from your opponent on effectively a low-value Profts, and then clear the way for later, because it is digging itself an extra card, and it guarantees you get some value off of it, like, basically all the time. Like, turn 1 Mako, turn 2 Profts shouldn't feel like a fantastic play, but it was a really good play in Standard. And then turn 3, you basically attack for 4 or 6, depending on, what your draws ended up being. Just kind of disgusting. So yeah, I think they kind of, justified banning all of these pretty well. I think all of these bans were pretty good. The one thing I think that will maybe come back to bite them is I don't really think they went far enough. I think that Standard has similar problems that I would say that Modern and Pioneer have, well, Magic in general has right now, of there's just so much like stuff that makes for horrible gameplay. And again, like, they're like, you don't have to like losing, right? And a lot of people are going to be unhappy because they lost, and that's just something that happens. But generally speaking, it feels better to play Magic in the way that, like, limited formats play, and it's kind of sucks if everything is an Omniscience type deck, Omniscience for Storm, whatever, like, not super interesting. So personally, for me, I would have liked to have seen some action taken beyond the scope of that, and I understand that their data doesn't support that, and whether or not I have issues with that. I've talked about it at length before, that I have issues with that type of approach, because oftentimes decks suppress the kind of data that you would see. Not every deck can adapt as well. Sometimes not everything is known all at the same time. For example, the Pixie deck took a while for people to figure out, even though people were toying with some of the stuff, like This Town loops were like, the moment that Storm Chaser's Talent was legal, people were playing Storm Chaser's Talent This Town decks. But those took a while before people realized, oh, we'll play it with the Duskmourn cards, and like nowhere to run, a Fear of Isolation and stuff. And so the Pixie deck took a while to hit Standard as well. So I don't really like operating under the assumption that like everything is known and that data is perfect, because it's not. And honestly, they probably don't even have enough data. We can see this with the fact that like Corey Steelcutter went from having 2 really bad matchups in its first major tournament week to having no bad matchups the next week, because that deck was able to adapt more. And we saw that with the Vivi deck, where the Vivi deck initially had some pretty bad matchups, even though most of them were pretty good, and then people just tuned the sideboards and main decks, and they just generally got better with playing the decks. And so as time goes on, I think you actually will find more like broken problem cards, for example, Enduring Curiosity, which should have been aborted out of the format months ago. Whether or not, like, Dimir is too good on power level, I think the inability to have meaningful counterplay to Enduring Curiosity is, like, a huge fucking problem. And I would have just gotten rid of Omniscience instead of Abuelos, and I think I mentioned that in prior ban list discussions and on Twitter and stuff, but Yeah, I think the Kona Omniscience is even if it ends up not being quite as busted as the Blue-Eyed Omniscience, it's still really good. It's still fairly consistent, and it still has this Omniscience bullshit problem in Standard that they have said they don't want, but, apparently turn 4 Omniscience is still okay.
Yeah, it's just leaving the door open for things like the Kona Omniscience deck feels odd to me, because as much as it can be fun for the first couple matches, especially for the person playing the deck, the gameplay is non-existent.
Yep.
You just put it into the maze and you tap your Kona, and the game ends on the spot. There's no counterplay a lot of the time. But WotC insists they want people to be able to try it, and it being good or not is kind of irrelevant to the problems it creates. It's just zero gameplay for basically either side of the board, but things just kind of happen, and if it works out for the person doing the omniscience thing, it ends immediately. Otherwise, the person on the other side just has to hope their Flood Maw is good enough. So,
right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's totally fine to have decks that do that thing. I don't think they should really be able to do it as consistently on turn 4. We do have quite a lot of card selection and card draw in the Standard format because it's so big. But if Omniscience never ends up being popular, it probably ends up being fine. I think for me personally, popularity of an archetype is something that is significantly more impactful on whether or not you should ban it than just raw power level or stats. And here's another thing too, right? It is significantly easier to play the good deck than to figure out how to beat the good deck, right? WotC can stand behind the deck has a 48% win rate, blah, 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 all they want. But if players don't know what decks are good against it, or the harder it is to figure that out, right, the less likely that is going to end up countering the decks. This is an argument for how you can have balanced metagames in open information, like, for example, League of Legends has a fairly open information mechanism. Now, I believe the aggregate sites that work for League of Legends, for example, don't have Riot's internal data, but they still have a lot of data available, and it's significantly easier to see what a counter matchup is, right? You can kind of just look up what counters what. Magic has no equivalent to that. All the data, WotC wants as little as possible of it out there, and if we're already reaching a situation where formats get solved and stale so fast, what do you really have to lose by making data more available, right? If anything, you probably have more to gain by the fact that people can kind of do what they did with Cutter and Vivi of, hey, this deck beat this deck this weekend, maybe we play that deck instead of the best deck, and maybe you can have a little bit more churn if people can more easily see that. Not everyone has...
At least they can focus on targeting or focus their efforts on exploring the decks that can do well potentially against Vivi, and we can get our answer much quicker on, well, is this something that's actually a dynamic metagame, or is this just solved? Yeah. And the fact that that can happen better is something that I think is worth exploring potentially.
I think personally too that under the old Standard cadence, I think hiding information made a little bit more sense because set releases were every 2 to 3 months, right? Rather than, 7 sets of Standard in a year, where, we don't have any sets that are 3 months apart now, which used to be, basically the standard for a while. And when you had more time between sets, you definitely had more time to, milk hidden information, and players also had more time to just kind of test all the different cards and see what worked. But now, everything is so truncated, things get solved so fast, and players are kind of just going to pick the winningest decks early on and try those out and focus their time on that. And yeah, in formats that take longer, you can have more decks like Esper Pixie pop up, which deck rose to popularity by countering specific things. Like Dimir was the menace before Pixie, and then Pixie just kind of capitalized on the fact that it was quite good against Dimir, and some of these other decks. And so I think you get significantly less churn when you have a shorter format, right? You just have less weeks, less events, going on, and a stale format is still going to be stale, right? But the churn can be expressed over a longer period of time. I would argue that if your format is only like 3 or 4 weeks, you technically couldn't have any churn at all, right?
Yeah, you have one, maybe 2 tournaments that matter at
that
time frame.
Right. The churn you have is when the next set comes in, and you hope that set makes an impact. And that's kind of what we were hoping for with Spider-Man. So
we didn't quite get it.
Yeah, what we did was we got a dual land. That was the impact from Spider-Man.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they made a bunch of mention about their lessons for Standard in the future, and I don't really want to read through it all. It's quite a lot. But I do want to touch up on some of it. That their idea is that they specifically mentioned that their cadence for the BNR announcements has caused Standard to suffer, and yes, that's absolutely true. And it doesn't really leave me with much hope that they still firmly believe in their underlying Standard ban list philosophy. But again, you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have predictable bans and just not ban things when you feel like you don't need to ban things. Like, no one is forcing you to ban something on a ban announcement, right? Like, we had that for years, where they would have one, like, every set release, and then another one, and they would just be like, yeah, no changes, no changes, no changes. But they would also talk about why and the state of the format and all these things. Like, you literally get to do both. And they decided that they didn't want to do both. And it doesn't really make much sense to me with that. They also appeared that one of the lessons that they've learned appears to have been a lesson that they've been continually learning for the last 10 years, which is, our bar for action and Standard remains high, but we do intend to intervene in situations like this where the format is clearly dominated by a single outlier deck with no clear angle of attack. And that's been a lot of decks over, the last, 5 to 10 years of Standard. And it always feels like they're just too slow to respond to these issues.
Yeah. It definitely feels like they are choosing to be way too reactive rather than proactive with these things. I understand for a lot of players, especially those who don't fundamentally understand formats in the same way that some other players do, it can feel odd when someone bans a card like Screaming Nemesis, even though they don't see it winning tournaments as much, or if they don't see it like actively being a problem in the same way that high-level tournament players do. Additionally, so let me see if I can pull up this excerpt. So there was a form, I think this might be in the Pioneer section. Yeah, that's probably for later, but there seems to be part of their ban philosophy is obviously they want their cake and eat it too. They want to be able to have the scheduled banned windows, but still be able to moderate the format in a way that makes sense. It's kind of inherently limiting the way they're doing it. Obviously, increasing the amount of windows they have is a step in the right direction, but Magic's different than it was like 8 years ago. Things get both solved quicker, and we have more powerful cards in the format because we have longer Standard rotation, but also just more sets a year. There is this kind of theory Dylan and I talk about from time to time, where there is kind of like a maximum amount of cards that can be playable in a Standard format. I'd call it like just around 100. The more cards you add to a format, it doesn't increase the amount of cards that are playable. It just means that less of the percentage of total cards get to be playable. So the format has to lean towards the higher power level end of things rather than more synergy things, and it just becomes similar to formats like Modern, where it's like it's mostly the cheap cards and the high synergy busted cards that get to see play, whereas sometimes in old Standard formats, you just play a high-value 5 or 6 drop, and it would win you the game on its own because you traded accordingly in the first couple turns. But we haven't had that sort of thing in years, where like a 5 drop gets to be important in the format. Like the last thing we had was like Aclazotz, but even then, yeah, it's like Goldspan Dragon even was his own problem. But like cards like Aclazotz is like. Right. It felt like a mediocre card in the decks that already did the busted things anyway. So it's hard to be convinced with how they want to approach the format when the format is so fundamentally different than what they seem to be describing. It's just things are so much more powerful, and they're lagging behind when things are even faster than they were before.
Right. I really don't think that people truly understand how fast standard formats get solved relative to years ago. It took people a while to solve Oko and Field of the Dead in standard. People were not believers at the start. It took quite a while, and those decks developed at different times. Oko took longer because Field of the Dead was overshadowing it, and that's kind of what we see in older standard formats. Is it's just slower. When the pace is faster, when there's more eyes on it, when the game has grown, when the communication is more readily available, you do need to moderate the game better. I understand Magic can't be a microtransaction-based, game in the same way that some of these online live service games are, but they do need to realize that there is significantly more competition for the trading card game and competitive game space. That, before COVID, there just wasn't very much competition, and so if you got something wrong, competitive Magic players didn't really have alternative games that they could go to play. There was a few, but not nearly as many today, but, there's a lot more competition now. So Wizards needs to work harder to not, just to keep players in the way of, I need to convince you to play Standard, that you enjoy the Standard formats. Before, Wizards didn't need to convince you to play Magic. If you wanted to play high-level competitive, card games, you effectively played Magic. Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon existed as well before COVID, but Magic was like the dominant space for the competitive card games. And it's hemorrhaging players. Other card games have gotten more attendance at their competitive events than Magic has this year. And so I really don't think that they've fully come to terms with the fact that they have to prioritize, creating a format that's players who want to play Standard want to play. Not just that, I can buy my deck and it's going to be there for longer. If those people don't end up actually wanting to play the Standard format when it rotates, it doesn't actually help you. You need players who want to play your format. And if players don't want to play your format, then I think they're just going to end up playing another game, or they're going to play Commander, and that's fine. Like, if they play Commander and they buy your Commander products, that's fine. You're still going to be making money off of them. But the ban philosophy, I think, relies around these hypothetical players that don't exist, and I don't think it fully recognizes the degree of competition for other games.
Yeah.
Let's
move on to Pioneer.
Yeah, so Pioneer.
About that.
So I have a lot of thoughts on this. Obviously, I play a lot of Pioneer. I'm one of the trophy leaders right now in the Pioneer Leagues, mostly with, some brews and stuff, the Sultai Superior Spider-Man Living End deck, but some others. And I 5-0'd with a lot of different decks, and I play a lot of Pioneer, and I have some thoughts before I read some of their things, or mention some stuff that they mentioned on their stream that they talked about. But I think this ban is fantastic. I probably would have banned more, but I'm someone who actively plays a lot of Pioneer, and it's my favorite format at the moment, though it still has a lot of problems in it. Less so now, but a lot of problems. That similar to what Standard had as well. But this ban is great, and I do think it's funny that they did mention that it had basically the highest best of one win rate of any deck they've seen. Now, I don't know how long they've been keeping track of that data, but yeah, this deck in Magic Online Pioneer is incredibly oppressive, super fucking busted, best deck by a fucking mile, and I have to imagine it is significantly worse for best of one. So I think Arena was a big jump start for them making changes to this format, but this ban was really good. And you basically could not adapt to Heartfire Hero at all. And so the reason for that was similar to in Standard. Now, obviously, if this looks like the Standard deck before bans, it basically is. They have some upgraded lands, Mutavaults, and Ramen Upper Roads and stuff. And Kumano faces Kakazan, but generally speaking, it's Embark Challenger, Manifold Masquerade, Nemesis, Sunspring, Link's Heartfire. It's like the same deck, right? Burst Lightnings and Monstrous Rage. And that's because it's the package is just that powerful. So what Heartfire Hero does is it forces you to have to play cheap removal that is efficient, and you have to play a lot of spot removal. You still take damage from the fucking Heartfire Hero, so you kind of need to overload on removal to do that. And you can't block because of the Mice package with Monstrous Rage and Manifold Mouse. So you can't really block with creatures very well. Cards like Ledger Shredder and stuff that traditionally have been good against red are just not good against Heartfire Hero. And so if you can't block, and it still has the Sunspine Link Streaming Nemesis problem of life gain doesn't matter. Also, life gain matters less when your opponent has a 5-power double strike trample creature. Gaining 4 life off of your kill spell or whatever just doesn't matter. So there's this tension where you have to play all this cheap, efficient removal, which generally speaking is mostly toughness-based red removal, or things like Elspeth's Smite, which we had issues with in Standard, in that, well, it doesn't line up very well against Monstrous Rage because they can just save it, and stuff like that. But, if you want to play cheap red removal to counter these red creatures, Screaming Nemesis and Heartfire Hero and Monstrous Rage totally punish you for that. But you also have to play, creatures to win the game with, because they are just so efficient at burning you out. Heartfire Hero also has haste because of Rockface Village, and it just always grows, and it's if you're low on life, you can't even block it with a smaller creature, because they can Monstrous Rage to give a trample, or if you just trade with their 3-power, their 3/2 Heartfire Hero with haste, you still just take the 3 damage, so it kind of just is a burn spell. So a fantastic man for the format, and something that I don't think people really understand the full gravity of, unless they play a bunch of Standard, I guess.
Yeah. It's one of those things where, this was a good ban, but there's still plenty of things wrong with the format. Yeah. The Pioneer Amulet deck is an abomination and should not exist.
Yeah.
But it also includes a card that probably should have been banned years ago in Lotus Field.
Yes.
But the fact that they've even decided to touch the format, I think, is a very good sign. It shows that they are still feeling the incentives on making this format a little bit more core to the Magic rotation and formats. But yeah, good changes are good, and we hope to see more of them.
Yeah, I will say, I think that if they ever add Pioneer for RCQs, it's not going to be a very fun format to play. We're going to have Scapeshift versus Greasefang. And Greasefang, when it was Abzan Greasefang, totally fine and healthy. Less consistent. Its backup plan was just a mid-range plan. The current Orzhov Greasefang, while yes, it's a new deck in an archetype that's popped up, it is the worst of the worst play experience to play against it, even when you beat it. It's a Thoughtseize heavy duress deck. They play a bunch of those effects, where all their early creatures are just these indestructible 3/1s, just actively indestructible 3/1s. You can't fucking kill them. And they just play Monument or Greasefang, and that's all they do. They don't pivot into a mid-range plan, they just try to do this. And they get to just, the combination of Seasoned Howlblade or Guardian of New Benalia with Monument is not very easy for most decks to beat, and it really exacerbates the problem of, hey, I'm just playing my combo card on turn 3, that Pioneer has a fairly large degree of at the moment. And then Scapeshift is Scapeshift. Scapeshift is somewhat held in check right now by people knowing how to play it, but also I think it's not the most fun deck to play on Magic Online with all the clicking and stuff. But that is a deck that I would expect to be super fucking busted in a Pioneer RCQ season. And honestly, Mono Red losing Heartfire Hero, deck is still tier 1. Mono Red is still one of the best decks in the format. You just don't play the Mice package, which is fine. Some versions didn't even play the Manifold Mouse version. They always played for the most part, Heartfire Hero, but you don't even need the Mice package for the deck to be good. There's plenty of prowess creatures. But in general, I think Pioneer has a lot of similar problems of Standard of, traditional Magic gameplay is not the most, present. We still have things like Arclight Phoenix, which with the presence of Cutter just gets to ignore a lot of what you're doing. Orsa of Greasefang, which again doesn't have to play a mid-range backup plan the way that Abzan Greasefang did, and Asika's Chariot makes for really great gameplay, whether you are playing against it or with it. And Orsa of Greasefang is just the most boring fucking deck on in the format.
Yeah.
And so yeah, like you kind of have that. And so while I don't think the format is in like a good place right now, I was very surprised to see them make any changes at all. But I'm very welcome to it. And they did allude that they are open potentially to doing a Pioneer RCQ season. That they have not locked in the RCQ season announcements, and that the next announcement is in February. So maybe we might see a Pioneer season announced in February. There's a chance.
Fingers crossed.
Right.
Let's move on to Modern. Modern, pretty surprising, no changes. We are in the dead center of an RC cycle.
Yeah.
Like, they are not going to actively make changes when we've got tournaments every weekend. So,
yeah.
Not surprising there. The fact that they're talking about some of the archetypes that are maybe problems, decks like Titan, both in gameplay as well as tournament maintenance, is nice to hear. One of the things I dislike about how they talk about Modern, and it's kind of like my issue with their format philosophy in general, is that there's a lot of talk about archetype diversity, which is a generally good thing, and I do like that, but there is a lack of talk about gameplay diversity. A lot of the problems that folks like myself have with formats like Modern is that either you are playing the most recent busted cards, like the Modern Horizons 3 cards or Ragavan Solitude type things, or you are just trying to combo your opponent. And it's just that lack of actual functional diversity is really uninteresting to me. It's like Titan does a specific type of thing, but it's still just a very resilient combo deck that just kills you on 4 almost every game. And there's things like Belcher, do the similar sort of thing, but their shell is different. They all just trying to do this turn 4 Goldfish through different types of resiliency. Belcher has counterspells, Amulet doesn't really care about its permanence in play very much, and it's hard to blow up anything that matters. Goryo's, at the very least, is like an interactive, like Thoughtseize midrange deck some of the time. But there's a lot of these decks that are just, I'm just going to Goldfish you on 4, and it's a different type of check on what types of cards you need in order to beat them. And it's just, while that is diversity in an important and helpful way, it doesn't feel like diversity when you're playing games against it, and just feels like you're playing a matchup lottery on how you built your deck for the weekend.
Yeah, For me personally, one of the most ironic things I think about Modern is Modern, they added so many fair cards to the format, right? Like, cards like Solitude and these other things, They added so many interactive cards to the format, but we still have this, matchup lottery issue in Modern. And I just find that very funny that we had a matchup lottery issue in old traditional, like 2015 Modern, where you would play a lot of Silver Bullet sideboard cards in your sideboard. And we still kind of have that in Modern today. Like, look at a fucking Esper Goryo's sideboard, right? Like, you've got a lot of hate pieces. Same with Blink and Boros and all that stuff. Like, most Modern sideboards are hate pieces. For as much as I've harped on Pioneer doesn't normally have a ton of hate cards in the sideboard. They have recently, because of how omnipresent Mono Red has been, that people will just play like a bunch of destroy red creature bullshit. But for the most part, that format isn't dominated by hate cards in the sideboard. You play a lot of mid-range cards in the sideboard, and you don't typically see that in Modern as much. A little bit, sometimes Belcher will play some mid-rangey stuff in the board, but
it's like a Tezzeret the Seeker.
Yeah, some card draw spells and stuff, but for the most, and obviously Amulet has some extra threats and stuff too, but for the most part, most of these decks, the sideboards are overwhelmingly just high impact cards.
Yeah, and it's just our Stony Silences and Fulminator Mages have just been changed out for Wrath of the Skies and Consigned to Memories. It's just it's just a different coat of paint.
Exactly. Yeah. I think I've mentioned before, in person and online and on Twitter. Hell, I've even mentioned it in the middle of Magic Online matches to my opponent that non-games in Magic are kind of hidden now. It feels like like a lot of games that you lose. It feels like you played Magic, and I'm not saying there's nothing to learn from a lot of games of Magic, but there are. I would argue the amount of non-games hasn't really changed in Magic. It's just what they look like has changed. I had a good example in against one of my standard opponents in a league post-ban where I was talking about, so yeah, say you keep a hand that's like Spyglass Siren, Flood Pits Drowner, Kaido, right? And then what, 4 lands, right? That hand seems like it always gets to play Magic, right? But there's tons of hands, good hands that your opponents have, where that hand where you just curve 1, 2, 3 doesn't play Magic, right? And that feels wrong to me, right? That your curve of 1, 2, 3 just doesn't play Magic. So people would keep that hand, and then maybe they lose, to I think the example I brought that up with was talking about before they banned Heartfire Hero. Say you keep a hand like that, right, of Spyglass Siren, 2-drop Kaido or whatever, and your opponent goes Heartfire Hero Manifold Mouse, right, on the play against you. Your hand doesn't function anymore, right? Sure, you can Flood Pits Drowner and then Kaido and stuff, but you're none of your stuff is really playing Magic, right? And so you have a lot of hands that, and some this does carry over to Modern as well, where you'll just have hands that are curves and playable cards. Amulet excluded because they play only lands, right? But but generally speaking, you have a lot of hands that feel like they play Magic, and then they don't really, because your opponent had their best card.
Yeah. I do think, for what it's worth, non-games changing at least their imagery in the sense that it feels like you play Magic, or it feels like you get to cast spells still.
Yes, it's good to have. It's still a good thing. Yes.
But at the same time, it's because that the format is so polarized. Yeah. We have just the power level of the cards, and the fact that this is a theory I was talking to one of my friends about earlier this week, where it's in formats with more powerful cards and games being ended sooner, you're just going to have less choices to make, period. Yes. And the fact that your 1, 2, 3 hand doesn't do anything leaves you with no choices left to make. You're just kind of stuck with what your opening hand was.
Something I really liked was, I used to play a lot of Pauper in years and years and years ago. And something I really liked about that format was all the games, for the most part, went pretty long. Sometimes you'd go up against Stompy or whatever and you just die real quick. But you had a lot of games that went pretty long, but not as control decks. And I know a lot of people don't like these grindy Siege Rhino mirrors the way that Tarkir Standard had, but something like Pauper, for example, felt like really high quality Magic, where you had a lot of opportunities to try to kind of get small edges when the games can go much longer and there's a lot more creature combat and stuff. Yeah, the quicker the game is, the more your opening hand is what matters. The less edge you have. The more powerful a threat is, the more snowbally 1s and 2-drops are, the more your game is determined by, can I interact with those, or can I combo kill them, right, in reverse. You don't really get the in-between games of, well, I can take some hits, I can lose some life as a trade-off of maybe I have a better target for my removal, and those are hallmarks of, limited gameplay, right? I love limited. Sealed not as much, but it's still better than a lot of constructor formats. I love draft, and what I really like is that you get to make those kinds of decisions in most draft formats. There are some where you just have to kill everything your opponent plays, but generally speaking, you get to decide if, well, can I take 12 damage off their 2-drop? So I can save this kill spell for their bomb later down the line, and then when they draw the bomb and you kill it immediately, you've already invalidated their 2-drop by playing your 4 or 5-drop. And that's something that actually makes for really good gameplay and a lot of skill decision trees that is nice in Magic. But yeah, the faster a format is, generally speaking, the less skillful it is.
Enough about Modern. Let's talk about Legacy. In Legacy, they made 2 changes.
What's Legacy?
Entomb. I know. Entomb going away, as well as Nadu. So, for a long time, Entomb had just been kind of this weird shadow in the format where it had just been good, but not great for a long time. Even the blue-black reanimated decks weren't playable for a long time. It was just Rakdos. You would just play Faithless Looting, and you would just try and do something degenerate as quickly as possible. But as of recently, because of the addition of powerful cards that the blue-black decks get to play, and then also just being able to be a permission deck, now this weird mid-range Dimir Reanimator deck had just been the best thing to do. As well as on top of the fact that we have better threats, the fact that we have Archon and Atraxa rather than just having to lean on things like Griselbrand and Chancellor of the NX. It definitely changes the shape of how cards like Entomb get to play. So feels pretty obvious, especially when we hear a lot of the Legacy experts talk about it. It's the lack of real counterplay. In the same way that a deck like Vivi was good in Standard, this deck has a very good mid-range plan, but it also has the best linear plan in the format. It's this is a typical trend we see in a lot of constructed formats where the combo deck that has the very good mid-range plan is basically always busted.
For Dimir, particularly in Legacy. Now, I used to play a lot more Legacy and pay attention to it in years past, though I still do pay attention now. They've had to ban multiple cards because of the Dimir-type archetypes. Grief and Troll of Khazad-dûm and Psychic Frog, they've all kind of been banned, and I don't necessarily buy that, if they banned Entomb from the start, they wouldn't have banned those cards. That's not necessarily true, but the fact that this deck has still persisted as high metagame share, high win rate, while being one of the most targeted decks, and surviving those bans, is probably an indicator that, Delver with a combo kill is actually kind of busted. And Tamiya, what a fucking card, right?
Yeah, kind of unreal that they printed that card into a Legacy format that has Brainstorm still in it. Yeah. I mean, happy for the Legacy players that get to play a better format now, especially since the other deck that did this sort of thing, the mid-range deck with the combo plan, Nadu, is also gone.
Right.
Less assuming of a deck, less broadly applicable.
More for Sensei's Divining Top reasons. It takes an incredibly long time to play that deck in paper. And that's a bit of a problem for tournament play. Well, it's also just good enough, and it's a lot less of a Legacy classic identity, right? Cephalid Breakfast, totally Legacy identity. Nadu, not nearly as much, even though it can be played in the Breakfast decks.
Yeah, and one of those things that, because of that, Legacy is very much leans on, these are the pillars of the format, we need really good reasons to want to move away from them, and Tomb was a very good thing, too good to maintain to being a pillar, whereas Nadu is just kind of almost the new kid on the block, and you're more okay just getting rid of him because he creates problems that you don't want. So, good for those players, happy that Legacy is changing. Slightly awkward timing with the fact that it's only 3 weeks out from Eternal Weekend, but 3 weeks is usually more than enough for players to get either new cards or develop new strategies with how they want to attack it. But yeah, glad the Legacy's getting the changes they want.
So we'll talk about Pauper, I think is the last one. I don't really want to go super in depth in Pauper because it's really not a ton to talk about. High Tide is banned again. I love that they did this, the trial unbans. I think this is one of the best ban-unbanned concepts that Wizards has ever had, and I really don't understand why they haven't really adapted this into other formats as much. You can be more aggressive with banning without feeling the pain of banning if you're willing to have these types of trial unban ban situations. And so it's good. Prophetic Prism was very problematic for years in Pauper, and now it's just an acceptable, sometimes not even very good card. Pauper's just so different and pushed now, but yeah, and High Tide, I remember when it was unbanned, I suspected it would be a mistake, and it wasn't immediately obvious as to what the deck lists exactly would look like. We had some concepts, we all kind of knew, peer through depths existed and hidden strings and stuff, but it wasn't abundantly clear that it was enough for the deck to work and exactly what it would look like. So it took a little bit of time for people to figure it out and to optimize the sideboards and stuff. But the big thing with High Tide in Pauper, I think that is a big reason it had to go, was Pauper lacks the sideboard options that other formats have because it's only commons. And that while that does mean that the format can have a lot of really dynamic gameplay and a lot of grindy, common, creature-driven combat, what you suffer with is you don't have cards like, just traditional hate cards, you don't have Eidolon of Rhetoric effects, right? You don't have damping sphere effects, which doesn't work against High Tide, but like in general, right? You don't have good sideboard options like that. So a lot of your sideboard cards are like Blue Elemental Blast, Red Elemental Blast, Relic of Progenitus, things of that nature. Nothing that is very good against like spell-based combos. And that's why Storm decks in older Pauper formats have traditionally had to have like everything banned from it. Like basically every Storm card is banned. I remember there was even a combo that used Sprouting Vines. Now Sprouting Vines is still legal, but there was a version of Storm that could use Sprouting Vines as a win condition, right? That's how unable decks are oftentimes to adapt. And so what we see with a deck like High Tide in Pauper is the polarized matchups is massive. It has like an insane amount of like 70 to 90% win rate matchups, and then it also has like 10% win rate matchups. And that's just not very good gameplay. So.
No. Yeah. Additional notes about an earlier point. The fact that we have like the ban unbans, that is, I agree, where is something I would wish they would explore more. A recent note, they unbanned Faithless Looting and Mox Opal, and both of those cards are fine in Modern. Sure, they had to ban Breach after unbanning Opal, but that was a card that needed to go anyway. But Affinity is a good deck in Modern, and is fun to play against some of the time. And Faithless Looting just kind of does nothing. We can try more of these things more often, and I wish they would even try to apply it to formats like Standard, where we go like, hey, streaming this is a little too good right now. Maybe in a year when we think we have it figured out, we unban it, and if after 3 months it still is a problem, we can just ban it again. And just there is so much to be gained from that potential philosophy that we just don't see, and I think that's a shame. And one of those kinds of things that I think WotC has a lot of missed opportunities when it comes to how they address formats, because they are just so obstinate on choosing this one way and trying to make it work.
Yeah. I think, too, that something that helps with the ability to experiment on that is cycling through more formats as RCQ seasons. If RCQ seasons are just Standard and Modern, then that basically means you can never take a risk on Standard like that, right? Because you might fuck up a whole Standard season. But if you have, as much as, I don't like Modern and I'm, forever a Modern hater, I'm totally fine with having a Modern RCQ season. One, I think it means that if a player doesn't like a format, that they get a natural break in the competitive season, so they're not playing every weekend of, an entire year, basically. They can, go lighter on a season. But the other benefit is if you have Pioneer, Modern, Standard as, your rotating 3 seasons, that means that you can take risks in one format when it's not that format's turn. And you don't feel the pain as much. You could ban something and then unban it experimentally and actually make that work if you don't have to worry about it for another 2 seasons. And so when it's kind of basically all Standard and then you get one Modern, you get 2 Standard again, you never have the option to take a lot of risks in Standard because there's no real gaps between the seasons anymore. The difference between Standard seasons now, so we just ended one Standard season. We're going to be entering another Standard season very quickly. The only difference between the two is Avatar is legal, and we had some bans, right? But there's not really much time difference. It's not like there's 3 months difference between those Standard formats. We're talking a couple of weeks. It's not nearly enough time for people to fully get all their cards and everything together anyway. It doesn't even feel like a different format. A rotation hasn't happened. So I think their current cadence of standard seasons also is really shooting them in the foot with the ability to kind of take innovative ban list approaches, which I think they need to do in an ever-growing sphere of competitive card games.
Agree.
So,
and not to talk too much about other games, but I did find it quite funny watching the difference between games like Magic and Flesh and Blood. We had the not an announcement of they're going to futurely ban Vivi, and between that announcement and the ban announcements on Monday, Flesh and Blood had 3 format changes.
Yeah.
They banned and unbanned cards 3 times in that window, and just...
Yeah, now they did fuck up, right? But...
Correct.
Yes,
correct.
But
they absolutely fucked up on the second one and corrected on the third, but it's like, they were willing to act, and they made the changes when they needed to, and it's one of those things where, like, sure, players were frustrated with the fact that the things happened in the way that they did, but the fact that things got to change and players got to experience new formats is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Yes.
But it feels like it'll be impossible to convince the folks at WotC that make those decisions, apparently, but it does seem at the very least that there are things to be hopeful from this announcement, both in the sense that they understand that what they have been doing recently isn't really acceptable, on top of the fact that maybe some of their formats or their philosophies need to be slightly more flexible. So, we'll see. Yeah. I am hopeful. I'm still a bit skeptical, but I want to give WotC the benefit of the doubt and hope for better formats in the future.
Yeah, it is a little... I think that... So, there is some degree of cognitive dissonance or reconciliation going on, at least in my head and in some other people's, where it feels weird that they swear that, standard play is healthy at the local level, while also it appears that they're in panic mode looking at the state of the format, right? And that feels kind of weird to me, because, like, if it was super healthy at the casual level, does it matter that much at the competitive? Yes, no, who knows? Personally, I think that, like, competitive and casual are actually an ecosystem where they operate. But, and then another thing, too, is I think that some of their data collection is maybe biased or not necessarily the most accurate, or they're just too focused on what, like, consumer data says rather than looking at some of, anecdotes, which, again, like... Anecdotes have their place, right? But, for example, we are based in Southern California, like the greater Los Angeles area, and you can't find a standard F&M. There are a couple stores, but for the most part, I love standard, and I haven't played standard in person in, like, fucking 4 months, Standard just doesn't fire anywhere. We have more people for Thursday Pioneer format than we have for standard in all of Orange County, basically. And so I really don't understand where all this standard play, this casual, small, non-competitive standard play is, when in the greater Los Angeles area, I've had some people I've known that have bought standard decks, and they live in Los Angeles, and they went to, like, 7 different shops across, like, 4 different days that those shops had listed standard on their schedule, and not a single one fired for months. And so how do you have one of the largest metropolitan areas in the United States with a large amount of Magic shops that are spread out enough that they don't necessarily compete with it, but how do you have this in the middle of your standard RCQ seasons and you can't fire local standards basically anywhere? In the immediate vicinity around us, so, Finch and Sparrow, Collector Legion, Spellhold, Crazy Nix, Shuffle and Cut, stuff like that. Shuffle's the only one that I've known that has fired standard in months. There's only one option, and so I don't really think that there... now obviously, like, this is, like, anecdotal, right? But I think there's an issue with some of their market research, their consumer data, because I don't see this play. Also, I do follow some of a lot of store owners across North America on Twitter and stuff, and I check their accounts, and then I also check the WPN Facebooks and stuff, and store owners are constantly complaining that standard doesn't fire. for them at all. So I don't know where the standard play that they allude to exists, because it certainly doesn't exist in the Los Angeles, Orange County area. And if it doesn't exist here, I have to imagine other major areas it also doesn't exist. RCQ attendance has been atrocious this last season. And so,
for context and clarification, we are talking about in reference to the announcement that was made on the 11th on Wednesday or on Tuesday, where they documented that by their metrics, Standard is still healthy and thriving at the local level, which I don't think I've seen anyone really confirm that from any region or any location. But for context, for those listening, that is the point we were talking about. Not from the Spawn announcement that we were reading over, but from the follow-up video the next day on the 11th.
And so they've made the statements, and not to necessarily say that they're lying, because they swear that it's truthful and factual, but I just can't see it. And I think that if you have a bunch of people telling you that they don't see this, they don't see this, they don't see this, I don't think the answer is to just tell them that, the data says it's there, right? I don't think that's a good policy to have. I think the assumption you should have is there an issue with our data collection? Is there something we're not seeing, right? And in many cases, that would be true. You might not be seeing something. But I just don't see standard play anywhere. And, and I know a lot of people who like to play casual standard, and I know many people who played Bloomborough, Duskmourn, Heartfire Hero standard, and they didn't really like it all that much, but they played it. And many of them just don't play Magic anymore. Because they bought decks. They bought standard decks and had nowhere to play in an area with 22 million people, and a bunch of card shops. And I also think it's telling that some of the largest card shops in Southern California don't even have very many Magic formats on their schedule anymore. Drafts don't fire very much because it's so expensive to draft. There's a few places that fire draft. Even Modern is kind of drying up at a lot of shops, and Standard is just not very common in an area with this many players. And so if even the large shops that pull in, that are destination shops, don't even have these events on their schedule, and they'll get RCQs, and they can charge a bunch of money, and they'll get good attendance for the RCQs, which obviously RCQs is not local players, right? Players will drive 1 or 2 hours, right? Sometimes more to go to an RCQ. But if even the big shops can't fire standard, I just don't know where that's coming from. I could buy some other countries potentially, and I do think there are probably I've seen some people post that standard has actually increased over the last 12 months in attendance for them in certain parts of the country, but at least here in a major metropolitan area, there's only a few shops that actually fire standard. There's a lot of shops leave it on the schedule. It doesn't cost you anything really to just leave it on the schedule, and it's good to have it scheduled, like standard showdowns and things like that. It's good to have it on the schedule, and you can't really tell. If you just look at these events these shops have standard on their schedule, you have no idea if it fires or not, right? Most shops don't even post winners or anything on social media, so you have no idea if it even fires. Unless you're going there in person. But of the people I know that have tried to play standard, they've gone to multiple shops and they just can't. So I think to an extent, I think WotC is missing something, and it does feel like they have felt the negative feedback and outlook on standard from both competitive and other ecospheres of competitive casual play interaction, that I think they are aware of issues, and maybe because something that I think about too is there are more incentives to play standard than any other format. You get standard showdown promos, there's store championships, which also oftentimes gives you pretty decent promos, and they're usually pretty local focused. There's multiple RCQ seasons. Basically every spotlight, every Grand Prix spotlight is standard. We have multiple standard pro tours. all the incentives are there to play standard, and then you can't fire it in these high populated areas, and that's just something to me that is just really bizarre. So
yeah. Oh, that was a discussion on the Monday ban announcement. Lot to talk about, lot to think about. I do think there was a lot of enlightening things from this announcement, a lot of things that we can look forward to potentially, but good to have the changes in the first place.
Yeah, I think it was a good ban announcement. I don't really understand why they had to wait 3 months to make it, and sacrifice the whole season, but yeah, I mean, it looks like that hopefully won't happen in the future, as they've already announced that there is, I believe, 7 ban windows next year. 7 scheduled ones, which is 6 more than they originally wanted, right? So, but yeah, so there's a degree of optimism. I mean, I don't really give them the benefit of the doubt anymore, because I think, personally, my opinion is that I think there's a high degree of incompetence at this fucking company, to even let things get to this point. And I think there are other issues that they talked about in, like, the video where, for example, like, because of how many sets they have to test at a time, like 6 or 7 sets that are all, like, not out yet, that they're all testing, because sets get released so fast that it's harder and harder to test these things, and catch things, and there's, like, other development issues involved with this. But this is about as good of a ban list announcement as I think they could have made, and I was very, very surprised to see Heartfire Hero and Pioneer, like, any changes to Pioneer, but I think that was one of the best things they could have ever done for this format, is just basically tell the Pioneer players and other players who don't even play Pioneer that, hey, we still are looking at this format, and that's something that's really nice, I think.
Yeah, so thank you all for joining us. I know it was a long talk, but we love talking about Magic, and we're glad that you like hearing it, so thanks, and hopefully we'll also hear our Avatar preview stuff as well, coming to real soon.
Yep.